Thank you. Right, as Sabina just said, Anna Marie Harrison, hi. So I'm in the early stages, very, very early stages of this PhD research at the Margarete von Brentano Center at the FU in Berlin. And this is historical perspective and based on archival work so far. So I come to this work from background in journalism and activism and also in history. So I'm not going to go too far into the sources. They're on the poster, and if anyone wants to know more about them, please ask. But it's based on a couple different studies that I found in a student archive at the university. So the first is conducted in 1994 under the Central Women's Representative at the time, Christine Färber, at the Freie Universität in Berlin. And this study focused specifically on the aftermath of sexual harassment cases. But what struck me when I read it, which is what kind of sparked this PhD idea, is how the list of suggestions for what the university should do at the end of this 1994 study were very modern, and they were the same kind of suggestions that I had heard fellow activists talking about in 2020, 2021, when I was doing my master's at the FU. So I'm also basing my understanding of guidelines, et cetera, on doing my undergraduate work in the US, which was very different in terms of how institutions handle sexual harassment than what I found in Berlin. So I'm going backwards a little in terms of the sources, because this 1994 study led me to a 1992 study, which just showed how many, many, many women at the FU reported being sexually harassed on campus. And then even further backwards in the late 80s, early 90s, you have a very broad and quite widely recorded public discussion on sexual harassment in West Germany in academia. The poster itself mentions this letter that I won't go too far into, but in 1989, there was this working group specifically on sexual harassment already at the FU, and this person, Petra Hörig, wrote to the university president saying, this is what needs to happen, these are our suggestions, and this is how your inaction has led to these cases of sexual harassment and assault. And the recommendations, again, are also quite modern. Some of them, yeah, I won't go into them. Anyway, basically, there's a clear body of sources that shows that over 30 years ago, this is a discussion. I think that's probably a surprise to no one in this room. So my question is, and my interest is, I'm in the middle of trying to find documents that would demonstrate, or sources, living sources, which is much harder, to tell me what the institutional response was to this very active discussion in order to trace from the early 90s how we got to where we are today at the FU and the current, most recent guidelines on sexual harassment that came out in 2020. So the guidelines that we have now are, of course, much better than no guidelines in the early 1990s. But there's quite a different approach in terms of uniformity of response and consequence. So yeah, my questions basically are just, how does such an active movement and engagement also with the activists themselves to a certain degree that is chronicled in media and in correspondence in activist groups and these archival documents, how does this get transferred into changes in the university structure, and how are they impacted by a mostly transient student body, but also faculty, of course, and the tenuous nature of employment at university. So people who are maybe active when they're there, but then just cannot stay for whatever reason. And then how does the hierarchy itself, of course, affect how movements effectively get defanged after a certain amount of time? In this broader question, of course, which is conference in general, but institutional forgetting, what's silencing, what's lip service, what's performative, and what's good faith efforts that just maybe don't go anywhere. So again, early stages of the research, but I also very much welcome feedback. And yeah, my project is just trying to trace from the early 90s how we got here today. And yeah, thanks so much.